Sarah Brennan was 22 years old when the Dakota Territory Court granted her divorce from Thomas Brennan on grounds of abandonment and cruelty. It was September 18, 1883, in Clearwater, Dakota Territory, and the divorce settlement gave Thomas the house, the land, and everything of value. Sarah received the barn, a deteriorating structure Thomas considered worthless, and permission to occupy it for 1 year to make arrangements for her future. The divorce itself had been nearly impossible to obtain. Dakota Territory, in 1883, recognized divorce only under extreme circumstances: abandonment, cruelty, adultery. And even with grounds, judges were reluctant to dissolve marriages. Marriage was considered permanent. A woman seeking divorce was challenging social order, admitting failure, marking herself as damaged goods. Sarah had filed in May 1883, after 3 years of marriage that had deteriorated from difficult to dangerous. She'd married Thomas Brennan in June 1880 when she was 19, a Norwegian immigrant's daughter with no family money, but strong work ethic. Thomas was 26, owned 80 acres with a house, seemed stable and hard-working. The marriage seemed like security. The first 6 months were tolerable. Thomas drank occasionally, but wasn't violent. He expected Sarah to manage the household, help with farm work, ask no questions. She adapted, learned to be quiet, learned to work hard enough that he couldn't complain. By year 2, the drinking increased. Thomas would spend days in Clearwater at the saloon, returning broke and angry, would blame Sarah for their financial problems despite spending their money on whiskey. The first time he hit her was March 1882, 14 months into the marriage. A backhanded blow across her face for serving dinner late. She'd been shocked into silence. He apologized the next day, claimed the alcohol made him lose control, promised it wouldn't happen again. It happened again 3 weeks later, and again. By year 3, the violence was regular. Thomas would drink, lose money gambling, return home angry, take his frustration out on Sarah. She learned to read his moods, to hide when he was drinking, to stay silent, to avoid triggering his rage. The final incident was April 1883. Thomas had been gone for 10 days, drinking and gambling in Deadwood. Returned broke, angry, violent. Beat Sarah badly enough that neighbors heard her screaming. Left her with broken ribs and a blackened face. Then disappeared again for 3 weeks. Sarah filed for divorce while he was gone. Went to the territorial judge with her injuries still visible. The judge, an unusually progressive man named William Patterson, looked at her face and granted temporary separation with hearing scheduled. At the hearing in August, Thomas didn't contest the divorce. He'd found another woman willing to marry him if he was free. He agreed to dissolution if he kept the property. The settlement was brutal. Thomas kept the house, an actual structure with walls and roof, kept the 80 acres, kept the livestock, equipment, money. Sarah received the old barn on the property's edge, a structure Thomas considered worthless and planned to demolish anyway. The judge granted her occupancy for 12 months to establish independent living arrangements, essentially giving her a year to figure out survival before complete destitution. The barn was 40 by 30 feet, built in 1876 when the previous owner occupied the land. The walls were rough-cut lumber, never properly maintained, now warping and separating. Multiple boards had fallen off completely. The roof was hand-split shingles, many missing, creating dozens of leaks. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges that squeaked loudly. The floor was dirt, uneven and muddy in places where water leaked through. But divorce left her with almost nothing. 22 years old, no family nearby, no money, no home. Just a deteriorating barn she could occupy for 12 months. After that, she'd have nothing again. Sarah made a decision that September. She'd build a small structure inside the barn, a room within a room. The barn itself was too large to heat and too damaged to weatherproof. But if she built a tight, small structure inside the barn's shell, using the barn as a windbreak and outer layer, she might create something survivable. She'd seen curved roof storage sheds in her childhood in Pennsylvania, arched structures built from bent saplings covered with boards or canvas. They required minimal materials and created maximum interior space with minimum volume. If she built a small arched structure inside the barn, maybe 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 7 feet high at the center, she'd have 96 square feet of living space that could be heated efficiently. With the $3 she'd hidden from Thomas during the marriage, she bought a handsaw for $1.50 and nails for $1.50. Everything else would be scavenged or built from materials available on the property. She began in late September. The barn was empty except for old equipment Thomas had abandoned. She cleared the center area, creating 12 by 8 feet of floor space. This would be her structure's footprint. For the frame, she needed flexible wood that could be bent into arches without breaking. Willow saplings grew near Clearwater Creek, approximately 1 mile from the property. She walked to the creek in late September, searching for saplings of appropriate size, 2 to 3 inches in diameter at the base, at least 8 feet tall, and, critically, still green and flexible. She cut the saplings using her handsaw, a process that took perhaps 15 minutes per sapling. The green willow resisted the saw blade, requiring sustained back-and-forth motion. She needed 24 saplings total to create 12 arches, 24 trees cut, limbed, and prepared. That was 6 hours of sawing work just to harvest material. Then came transporting them. Each sapling was 8 feet long and weighed perhaps 15 pounds when freshly cut and still full of moisture. She'd bundle 3 or 4 saplings together, hoist them onto her shoulder, and carry them the mile back to the barn. That required 6 trips, carrying roughly 60 pounds each time. 6 miles walked while carrying awkward, heavy loads. The arch construction was where real difficulty began. Green willow is flexible, but requires significant force to bend into a semicircle. Her method was to dig shallow holes 18 inches deep on either side of her 12 by 8 foot footprint, holes spaced 8 feet apart. She'd insert one end of a sapling into a hole, pack dirt around it firmly, then slowly apply bending pressure to curve the sapling across the 8-foot span to the opposite hole. The bending required her full body weight. She'd grip the sapling at its midpoint and pull it down gradually, fighting the wood's resistance. The willow would creak and groan, fibers stretching. If she applied too much force too quickly, the wood would split. If she didn't apply enough force, the arc would be too shallow and wouldn't reach the opposite hole. Once bent sufficiently, she'd insert the free end into the opposite hole, pack it firmly, then adjust the curve until it formed a proper semicircular arch. At the apex, where the 2 ends met overhead, she'd bind them together with rope and wire, scavenged from the barn's abandoned equipment, twisting the wire tight, creating a secure joint that would hold under stress. The first arch took 3 hours to complete, including digging holes and securing the joint. By the 12th arch, she'd improved her technique and could complete one in 90 minutes. Still, 12 arches required approximately 24 hours of sustained physical labor spread across 5 days in early October. Her hands were raw by the time the frame was complete. The rough willow bark had scraped her palms bloody. The sustained gripping and pulling motion had strained every muscle in her arms, shoulders, and back. She'd wake each morning barely able to move, needing an hour of slow stretching before her body would function normally. By early October, she had the frame complete. 12 willow arches spanning 8 feet wide, spaced 1 foot apart, creating a curved tunnel shape. The structure looked skeletal, bare ribs creating an arched form. For the walls and roof, she needed boards. The barn itself provided material. She carefully removed boards from the least damaged sections of the barn walls, boards Thomas wouldn't notice missing from the deteriorating structure. Each board was perhaps 6 inches wide, 12 feet long. She'd cut them to fit the arched frame. She attached boards horizontally to the arched frame, starting from the ground and working upward. The boards followed the curve, creating a smooth, arched surface. She overlapped them slightly, creating a shingled effect that would shed water. Used every nail carefully. She only had 2 pounds of nails total. The curved shape meant no sharp corners, no edges where cold air would settle. The arch distributed structural stress evenly, and the curved surface would shed wind, creating less resistance than a flat wall. By late October, the exterior shell was complete. A small arched structure inside the barn, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 7 feet high at center. From outside, it looked like a tunnel or a covered wagon without wheels. The curved roof created perhaps 80 cubic feet less volume than a rectangular structure of the same floor space, meaning less air to heat. For the door, she built a small frame at one end, 3 feet wide, 5 feet high, just large enough to enter while minimizing heat loss through the opening. Hung a door made from scrap boards. Inside, she created minimal furnishings. A sleeping platform built from boards along one wall, storage shelves along the other wall, a small area for her tiny cast-iron stove, a miniature stove Thomas had discarded that was too small for the house, but adequate for heating 96 square feet. She insulated the structure with everything available, stuffed dried grass between the willow ribs before attaching the boards, creating an insulation layer. Hung old blankets against the interior walls, additional insulation and moisture barrier. The curved shape meant less surface area than rectangular walls, meaning less heat loss through the shell. The barn itself became the outer shell. Sarah's arch structure sat inside the barn, with 3 feet of space between her walls and the barn walls on all sides. This created a dead air space, a buffer zone between her heated inner structure and the outside cold. The barn, leaky and damaged as it was, still blocked direct wind. The air gap provided additional insulation. By early November, Sarah was living in her structure inside the barn. The townspeople who knew her situation called it various things. The woman living in a barn like an animal. The divorced woman who'd built a tunnel in a shed. The Brennan woman who'd lost her mind after the divorce. Robert Chen, the town's builder, visited in mid-November out of curiosity. Walked through the barn to find the arched structure in the center, examined the curved roof, the willow frame, the scavenged boards. "Mrs. Brennan, you've built a chicken coop inside a barn. This isn't adequate housing. It's maybe 8 feet wide. You can't stand upright at the edges. You're living in a tunnel. This is desperate poverty made visible. The structure is weather-tight and efficiently heated. The curved shape requires less volume to heat. The barn provides wind protection. This is engineered shelter, not poverty. It's a curved shed inside a deteriorating barn. The barn will collapse eventually. This whole arrangement is temporary at best. You need proper housing." But the mockery came from the same people who judged her for divorcing Thomas. A divorced woman was already suspect. Divorcing meant failure, meant something wrong with her, meant she couldn't maintain a marriage. Now she was living in a barn in a handmade tunnel. The judgment was layered and relentless. Through November, the structure performed well. Outside temperatures dropped to 20 degrees. Inside the barn, maybe 25 degrees. Inside Sarah's arch structure with a small fire burning, 65 degrees. The small volume heated quickly. The curved walls distributed heat evenly. The insulation and the barn's outer shell prevented heat loss. She burned maybe 3 small logs per evening. The miniature stove heated the space rapidly. The low ceiling and curved walls kept warm air from rising and escaping. She'd sleep comfortably, wake to a cold structure, build a small morning fire, warm the space again. Her neighbors in conventional houses were burning wood continuously. The Morrison family's house required fire day and night to maintain 60 degrees. Sarah used 1/10, the wood maintaining 65 degrees in her arched structure. December brought the test that would prove everything. The blizzard arrived December 15th with weather conditions that would be remembered as the coldest storm in Dakota Territory recorded history. The storm developed with unusual speed. Morning of December 15th started at 10 degrees, cold but normal for mid-December. By noon, 0 degrees. By 3 p.m., minus 15 degrees. The temperature drop was catastrophic, 25 degrees in 6 hours. But the temperature was only part of the danger. The wind was the real killer. Wind built from calm morning to 20 miles per hour by noon to 40 miles per hour by afternoon. By evening, December 15th, sustained winds of 70 miles per hour were recorded at the Clearwater Weather Station. 70 miles per hour of minus 35-degree wind. The effective temperature approached minus 70 degrees. Exposed flesh froze solid in under 60 seconds. Breathing outside caused immediate frostbite in lungs. Any structure not built to withstand hurricane-force winds would fail. The barn began failing within the first 6 hours. Sarah could hear it from inside her arched structure. The shrieking wind hitting the barn walls, boards creaking under stress, nails pulling loose. By midnight, December 15th, individual boards were ripping free. She could hear them tearing away, the sound of wood splintering, the crash as boards hit the ground outside. By dawn, December 16th, day 2, the barn was critically compromised. Entire sections of wall had blown away. The northwest wall, taking the direct brunt of the wind, was gone completely. Just support posts remained, the boards scattered across the snowy landscape. The roof was shedding shingles continuously. Snow was drifting inside the barn through the massive gaps. The barn was essentially gone as a protective shell. What remained was a skeleton of structural timbers offering minimal wind protection. Sarah's arched structure sat exposed, with only the partial barn frame providing any barrier between her and 70-mile-per-hour wind. But the arched structure held. The curved shape was critical. When 70-mile-per-hour wind hit a flat surface, it created maximum pressure, like hitting a wall. When wind hit a curved surface, it flowed over and around, like water flowing over a stone. Sarah's arched roof shed wind. The curved sides deflected pressure. And critically, the low profile meant the structure presented minimal target for the wind to strike. The tight construction mattered too. Every board was nailed securely. Every joint was reinforced. There were no loose elements to catch wind. The structure was essentially a solid, curved shell, one piece rather than an assembly of parts. Inside, the temperature dropped significantly without the barn's protection. Previously, the barn shell had maintained perhaps 30 degrees inside, even when outside was 0. Now, with the barn walls gone, the temperature inside Sarah's structure dropped to 40 degrees with no fire burning. The insulation, dried grass between the ribs, blankets on the interior walls, prevented worse heat loss. She burned her small stove continuously, something she'd never needed before. 3 small logs every 3 to 4 hours, instead of the normal every 12 hours. The tiny volume meant even continuous burning didn't require massive wood consumption. The curved ceiling kept warm air from rising and escaping. She maintained 50 to 55 degrees inside her structure, while outside was minus 35 degrees, and the barn around her was being destroyed. On day 3, desperate knocking on the barn's remains. James Morrison appeared through the blowing snow, frost-covered, hypothermic. His family's house had dropped to 38 degrees. His wife and children were showing dangerous cold exposure. He'd heard Sarah was somehow surviving in the barn, had come desperate for help. "Please," he said through cracked, frozen lips. "Our house is failing. Can we shelter here?" Sarah's structure was 96 square feet. Could it hold 7 people? The mathematics were different than previous calculations. More people meant more body heat. Maybe 700 BTU per hour from 6 additional people. But also more moisture, more carbon dioxide, more crowding. The tiny space would be overwhelmed. Bring your family, we'll fit. The Morrison family, parents and 4 children, crammed into Sarah's arched structure. 9 people in 96 square feet. Everyone sitting with knees drawn up, children layered in the sleeping area, adults against the curved walls. The crowding was suffocating, but the temperature rose to 60 degrees just from body heat. The small stove supplemented. Everyone survived. Through 4 days of minus 35-degree weather, Sarah's handmade arch structure kept 9 people alive. The barn around it was destroyed, boards blown away, timbers exposed, essentially gone. But the curved structure withstood the wind, maintained heat, functioned when everything else failed. When the storm ended December 19th, families emerged to find conventional houses barely above freezing, wood supplies catastrophically depleted, and fundamental assumptions about shelter completely shattered. The Morrison house, conventional frame construction that had cost $300 to build in 1881, was 32 degrees inside. They'd burned furniture, broken apart beds and tables, fed everything combustible into their stove for 4 days straight. Their winter wood supply was 70% depleted. At current consumption rates, they'd run out by February. Then what? The Wilson family's house was 35 degrees. The Henderson cabin was 29 degrees, actually below freezing inside a supposedly weather-tight structure. Multiple families had children showing dangerous cold exposure symptoms from living in houses that couldn't maintain life-supporting temperatures despite maximum heating efforts. Meanwhile, Sarah's handmade arched structure, built inside a destroyed barn with $3 and scavenged materials by a divorced woman everyone pitied, had maintained 55 degrees through 4 days of minus 35-degree weather with minimal fuel consumption. The barn around it was gone, but the curved structure withstood 70-mile-per-hour wind, maintained heat with a miniature stove, and kept 9 people alive when everything else failed. The transformation in community attitude was immediate and profound. The divorced woman living in a tunnel became the engineer everyone needed to consult. The curved structure everyone had mocked became the design everyone wanted to understand and replicate. James Morrison came to Sarah on December 20th, his voice hoarse from 4 days of cold, damaged breathing. "You saved my family. Our house, a proper house that cost $300, failed. Your structure built from scraps kept us alive. I need to understand how. I need to build something similar for my family." The principles are straightforward. Curved shapes shed wind rather than resisting it. Small volumes heat efficiently. Tight construction prevents heat loss. Structure within structure creates insulation layers. These aren't complicated concepts. They're just physics most people don't consider. But everyone said your structure was inadequate. Everyone said the barn would collapse on you. Everyone said you were living in poverty. Everyone confused poverty with stupidity. I didn't have money for conventional construction, so I built unconventional construction using principles I understood. The structure worked not despite being cheap, but because being cheap forced me to focus on efficiency rather than size. By late December, 7 families had visited Sarah's structure to study the design. She'd explain patiently, answering questions, sketching diagrams in the dirt, teaching adults who'd been building houses for decades about principles they'd never considered. The most striking moment came when Thomas Brennan appeared on December 23rd. Sarah's ex-husband, who'd given her the worthless barn in the divorce settlement, who'd beaten her for 3 years, who'd considered her stupid and worthless. Standing in the destroyed barn, looking at the arched structure that had survived when his house had nearly failed. He didn't apologize for the violence, didn't acknowledge the years of cruelty, but he said, voice quiet, "The barn I gave you as an insult became your salvation. The structure you built kept people alive when my house barely kept me alive. I thought I was giving you nothing. You made it into something better than what I kept." Sarah looked at him with emotions too complex to name. Anger at the years of abuse, satisfaction at proving him catastrophically wrong, sadness at wasted years, relief that she'd survived. "You gave me a worthless barn because you thought I was worthless. I built something that worked because I knew I wasn't. We're divorced. I don't need your acknowledgement, but I accept it." Thomas left. They never spoke again. But word of his visit spread through Clearwater. The story of the divorced woman who'd outbuilt her abusive ex-husband, who'd survived on scraps and intelligence when he'd failed with money and conventional construction. By January 1884, Sarah had consulting work. Families paid her to design emergency inner shelters, small structures within their existing buildings. $5 per consultation, $25 in January alone, more money than she'd ever had at once. The Wilson family built an inner shelter in their barn using Sarah's principles. The Morrison family built one in their attic. The Henderson family built a small arched structure in their cabin's main room, creating a heated inner core they could retreat to during extreme weather. She taught them all the same principles. Curved roofs shed stress and wind. Small volumes heat efficiently. Insulation matters more than thickness. Dead air spaces provide thermal barriers. These weren't revolutionary concepts. They were basic physics, applied with desperate efficiency. She lived in her arched structure through that winter and the next, continuously improving the design. By spring 1884, she'd rebuilt the barn around her inner structure. Not fully, but enough to provide a windbreak shell again. The new barn walls were minimal, just enough to create that critical dead air space between her inner shelter and the outside elements. She filed for homestead rights on unclaimed land in spring 1884, using money saved from consulting work. The Territorial Land Office initially questioned a divorced woman filing a loan, but her demonstrated self-sufficiency and the testimonials from families she'd helped convinced them to approve her claim. By age 23, she owned 160 acres free and clear. She built a proper house on her homestead in 1885, conventional frame construction because she could afford it now, but she incorporated principles from her arched structure: lower ceilings to reduce volume, better insulation, curved interior partitions in key areas. The house was half the size of conventional homesteads, but used 1/3 the heating fuel. She kept the original arch structure as guest quarters and as proof of concept. People would visit from surrounding communities to see the curved shelter that had survived the blizzard of 1883. Sarah would show them everything, explain the physics, demonstrate the efficiency. At 24, she'd become known throughout Dakota Territory as an expert on efficient shelter design. The legacy extended beyond her individual success. By 1886, 14 families in Clearwater had built emergency inner shelters based on Sarah's design. By 1888, the concept had spread to neighboring towns. Local builders were incorporating curved elements and inner structure principles into conventional construction. The blizzard of 1883 had killed 63 people across Dakota Territory, but it also forced innovation in shelter design that would save countless lives in future storms. Sarah never remarried. She'd had enough of depending on men, enough of being someone's wife, enough of the vulnerability that came with marriage in the 1880s. She lived independently on her homestead, consulted on shelter design, and proved that a divorced woman could build a successful life outside the social structures that tried to contain her. She died in 1941 at age 80, having lived through 58 additional Dakota winters in structures she'd designed and built herself. Her obituary in the Clearwater Herald focused primarily on the arched structure, The curved shelter built inside a barn by a divorced woman with $3 that had saved 9 people during the coldest blizzard in territorial history, and had revolutionized emergency shelter thinking across the territory. The story is about a woman left with nothing, who built shelter from scraps and knowledge, who survived when everyone said she'd fail, who proved that understanding structure and physics matters more than money or social status. Because sometimes the woman building a tunnel in a barn knows more about survival than people building conventional houses. The arched structure everyone mocked was the only shelter that actually worked when weather turned lethal.